Hello everyone, welcome to this video entitled Defeating the Fear of Death for Engineers. I will explain later why I decided to add for engineers, but for now basically what I intend to do is to deal with pathological fear of death, also called thanatophobia, to give out some tips on how to gain some control over this problem. Now, given that fear of death is perfectly natural, of course, it's a normal instinct from every living thing, thanatophobia occurs specifically when this fear is too intense or exaggerated. It becomes pathological at that time when it gives us panic attacks, depression, anxiety. So what I simply want to do is to share what stems out of my personal experience. I dealt with this for some time, and I have tried to analyze it, and I've come up with some realizations, some tricks. I think they're pretty universal, and I think that because of that they can help other people. Now, some important disclaimers. I am not a mental health care professional, so formally I cannot tell anyone what to do and what not to do. I accumulated some personal knowledge on cognitive behavioral therapy, but again, the meat of this video is really mostly my experience and the tricks that I found and that I'm going to relate to you. Okay, so now this brings us to why I said for engineers in the title. Well, simply is that I am an engineer and I am familiar with the method of resolving problems that are very practical and very result-oriented. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that's going to understand that there's very little theory behind what I'm going to tell you. It's a very rational approach. So you do not need to be an engineer or a technical person or a scientist or anything like that, of course. What I meant is really that you just need to approach this with a rational mind, as much as you can muster, and anybody can do that. So good. Next, we go to step one of the presentation, and that will be defining the problem. And this is a very important step. Most people, as I said, are afraid to die, and that's perfectly normal. But most people have also accepted death and their mortality since their teens, since their adolescence, and they have integrated that aspect of their life in their psyche, and therefore their life is not disrupted and paralyzed by this fear. Other people, people who are afraid, unfortunately, they have never accepted this reality. Their fear is paralyzing. It turns to anger, it turns to depression, anxiety, etc. So in most cases, I believe this is a trauma that occurs at adolescence or pre-adolescence, where we simply never mature past the realization that we're going to die. So we drag this fear with us throughout all our lives, from our pre-teens, and we never therefore mature past our adolescence. In this respect, we are still struggling teenagers, and we need to mature past this mental block. This is what this video hopefully will do. Okay, before continuing, I wanted to make a small parenthesis on the subject of religion. First of all, to say that whether you are an atheist, an agnostic, a religious person, a spiritual person, you are statistically just as likely, with very small differences, to suffer from thanatophobia. So there is no metaphysical outlook that insulates you better from that problem. Now, atheists might fear death because obviously, not believing in an afterlife, they might just find the concept of their approaching death very ominous and very upsetting. Believers, on the other hand, might be fearing that their belief is caused by fear of death. This is what atheists call a crutch sometimes. And, believers might be sensitive to that. They want to get rid of that crutch. They want to have their faith be serene and be independent of other factors. And of course, both atheists and theists might have secondary doubts on their nominal faiths. They might believe that they might be wrong and there might be consequences one way or the other. So whether you are a believer or an unbeliever, an atheist, an agnostic, whatever, you can equally benefit from defeating fear of death, maybe for different reasons. But you will find this video useful, I hope, one way or another. And this is why I will not mention religion again for the rest of the video. It's not necessary. This is a look at how I intend to proceed. First, the first step, extremely important, is to recognize the nature of the problem. And what I mean is that the main obstacle, I believe, to resolving this fear is that we don't realize that to different people, fear of death means different things. You need to know exactly the type of fear of death that you are experiencing. They're not all the same. Thanatophobia is an umbrella term which includes many, many, many different things. More specifically, you might be afraid not only of death itself, but sometimes your main problem is with consequences of death. In other words, you might be afraid of leaving your family destitute, or you might be afraid of not having accomplished all the things that you wanted to accomplish in your life. Well, these are not actual fears of death itself. This is fear of consequences of death. In order to properly understand this distinction between proper fear and any fear, well, here's a small example. Person A is afraid of locusts and grasshoppers. He simply doesn't like the way they look, they fly, they smell, they move, their color. He's afraid of being in the same room with this insect. So this is his situation. On the other hand, person B has a lot of land and farmland, and she is also afraid of locusts. But because she's afraid that the locusts in large number, the grasshoppers might come and destroy the crops, which will turn into a loss of revenue. So she's actually afraid of the loss of revenue. That's a primary fear. So even though they're both afraid of locusts, person A has a proper fear, whereas person B only has fear of the consequences. So the same goes for people who are afraid of death itself rather than consequences of death. By now, it should be abundantly clear that it is crucially important that you precisely identify the type of fear you're facing, especially to know if your fear is existential or secondary. The simplest way to do this is to take time, take long walks while meditating, and just ask a simple, single question. It is an obvious question, and yet many of us never consider it. The question is, what exactly about death really frightens me? And look for detailed answers. Something like, I fear death because I'm afraid I will not be remembered. Or, I fear death because I cannot deal with non-existence. So come up with precise answers. You will be surprised that as soon as you get precise answers, you will immediately find some relief. Not because you solved your problem, but because at least you now can see the monster that you're fighting. You can also devise better strategies to fight it. It is a good idea now to talk about these secondary types of thanatophobia, the secondary type of fears that we just mentioned. Here's a list that is not exhaustive. You can come up with your own items here, but this is the ones that I believe are the main ones. Unfinished business. For instance, you might feel that you haven't finished a project that you started and that you absolutely wanted to finish, a lifelong project. Or you may have unfinished family duty that you need to attend to, raising children, providing, etc. Or you simply may have a bucket list, certain things that you wanted to do before you die, and you're afraid of not getting to do all of them. Next, you could be afraid of missed opportunities, therefore not being able to enjoy retirement, for instance, or might be afraid of ending life before life gives you all the joys that you expected from life. Some people may be afraid of legacy. They may feel that their life did not achieve much, that they may be perceived of having lacked accomplishment, fear of being forgotten. This is a legacy. Then there are consequences for the living. You may be afraid that your death might bring about economic disaster in your family, or simply you may be afraid that your death might bring about large and important psychological distress with your loved ones. There are final hour physical issues. You might be afraid that the process of dying will bring about loss of independence, relying on others, and your death might not be dignified as you might expect it. You may be afraid simply of physical pain that comes with disease in your final hours. And then, of course, you have religious or metaphysical fears. You may be afraid of hell, or you may be afraid of being reincarnated in a lower form, depending on your conviction. You may be afraid of the unknown, and that's it. So these are all secondary fears. If you find that your main fear of death is reflected in one of the items shown in the list, then you're not actually afraid of death proper, rather the consequences of death. Now, because your problem is too specific in this case, it cannot be handled individually in this video. But it is my hope that just by understanding that your fear is something specific rather than death, which is a much larger idea, that might help you in choosing a therapy, perhaps, or changing the course of the way you were going to face your fear. Because now you know exactly what your problem is, and it's pretty specific rather than be general. Instead, the item that is notably missing from the list is existential fear of death. It's not mentioned in the list because it's special. In other words, you may be afraid of dying, period. You're afraid of ceasing to exist, permanent demise, literally not being. This is proper fear of death or existential fear of death. And if this is the type of fear that you have, then the next section of the video offers concrete ideas, mental exercises, specifically to show to your subconscious that this kind of fear of death is fundamentally irrational. Just to restate, we said that secondary fears, that is, fears of consequence of death, are usually rational, so they can be more easily recognized and confronted. Now, to the surprise of many of us, it turns out that most people suffering from thanatophobia actually suffer from secondary fears. Chief among them is the fear of physical pain that often accompanies death. On the other hand, fear of death proper, that is, existential fear of death, is always irrational. So even if only a smaller portion of us suffer from existential fear, this fear is more difficult to tackle because it cannot be easily framed, recognized, and combated. Hello again. As you can see from the background, I have spent the last few weeks preparing the second half of this video. These are the thought experiments that deal specifically with existential fear. Before we do the exercises, I need to lay down some assumptions that need to be made when doing the exercises. Of course, again, is that these exercises are really only about existential fear or fear proper. It is not about any of the secondary fears. In fact, the whole goal of the exercise is to eliminate existential fears, which, as we said, are irrational, so that you're only left with secondary fears, which, as we said, are usually rational. Secondly, I need to remind everyone here that the approach has to be only rational. Please leave emotional reactions aside for now. You first need to give intellectual assent to a given proposition, even if emotionally you do not accept it. The emotional acceptance will come later through standard exercises. Only later will convince your subconscious of the truth that your conscious has already accepted. Finally, the last assumption is that we must assume a non-dual nature of man. That is, we must assume that the soul and the body are not separate things. In other words, we must not assume that they can detach from each other so that the soul survives after death. Rather, we must assume that the soul is the same thing as your brain, or the electrochemical state of your brain. That is, when you die, your brain dies, and so does your soul. The reason we assume this is not because it is necessarily true. In fact, if you are religious, chances are you do not believe this. Rather, we assume this because this is the worst case scenario for someone with existential fear of death. There would be no point in trying to defeat fear of death if we assume that the soul does not actually die. The first thought experiment is the most basic. Here we go. Assume that you learn with incontrovertible evidence, such as a hidden camera, for instance, that the following happens to you every single night when you fall asleep. While you are in deep unconscious sleep, a powerful being, such as an extraterrestrial scientist, or a demon, or an angel, as is shown here, appears in the room and brings with him an exact replica of your body. This replica is exactly identical to you, except it doesn't have a brain or a soul of its own. In other words, it is a zombie version of you. The being then proceeds very carefully and without waking you up to open your skull, transfer your brain to the new body, and then disposes of the old body. This could be called a body transplant. This new body, with your brain, will then continue sleeping through the night and simply wake up in the morning. Without the video camera evidence, he would never have known that anything had happened to him during the night. In fact, the video evidence and other evidence convinces you that these events do not happen to you every night, but they also happen to everyone else in the world every night. So this is actually a common event. Note also that our bodies, in reality, do undergo a process of change while we're sleeping every night. Many cells in our body die off during sleep and others are generated. So in other words, even in the real world, we always wake up with a body that is actually different from the body that we had when we went to sleep. Thus, our thought experiment describes something that actually does already happen in reality to some extent. Therefore, under these circumstances, once you've overcome the initial emotional shock of learning about these things, my question is, would you be afraid at that point to go to bed and to go to sleep? I think you should easily answer that you would not be afraid. After all, this is very similar to a natural process. And at no time was your brain affected. Your brain is your soul, remember. So I think that, as I said, you should not be afraid of this particular scenario, and you should have no problem going to sleep tonight knowing that this is going to happen to you. Now, once you've convinced yourself that this particular scenario does not threaten you in any way, at that point, you're ready to go to the next thought experiment. In this scenario, the angel again appears in the middle of the night while you are unconsciously asleep. This time, he does not have a replacement body. What he does instead is that he, again very gently and without you noticing, he kills you. Once you're dead, you of course start to decompose immediately while he hangs around the room not doing much. Later on, at about 4 a.m., after you have been dead and decomposing for a few hours, the angel goes back to your corpse and through his powers begins to regenerate all your lost cells in your brain, in your muscle, in your organs, until your body is back to normal. He then revives you so that you're alive again and sleeping. You later on wake up as usual. Now, in this case too, we have some parallels with what actually happens naturally every night. In fact, every night, when you enter deep sleep, which is a particular part of the sleep cycle, you're completely unconscious. Your body simply vegetates. It's similar to a piece of celery. I mean, it has no higher intellectual functions. It's simply there. Your soul, for all intents and purposes, is as good as dead. There's no activity, and it's completely suspended. So, in a sense, this scenario describes something that already kind of happens in real life. Under these circumstances, therefore, once again you've overcome the initial shock. Would you be afraid to go to bed and to go to sleep? Again, considering that what the scenario describes is very similar to a natural process, I would think that you should not be afraid. And I would like you to convince yourself of that. In doubt, ask yourself, why would I be afraid of what could be a natural process? Considering that it leaves me absolutely integral and the way I was at the beginning of the night the next morning. I would like to now present a different version of this thought experiment. It's the same idea, but maybe emotionally will have a different import. But again, from the functional point of view, is exactly the same thing. In this variation, the angel kills you just like before. But this time, he then proceeds to incinerate your lifeless body. In other words, instead of having you decompose away so that you and your body are destroyed slowly, the angel destroys you quickly. In both cases, you're dead. In both cases, your remains are destroyed, except that they are destroyed to a larger extent in the second version. But qualitatively, the two scenarios are practically identical. The rest of the thought experiment is identical to the first version. That is, later on, the angel, just as he did in the first case, regenerates your dead organ cells, all of them in this case, and then revives you so that you can wake up normally in the morning. Now, please convince yourself that really there are no functional differences between the first version and the second version of this thought experiment. These two scenarios are identical. So if you accept the first, there's no reason why you shouldn't accept the second. They're identical in all intents and purposes. So once you're reasonably convinced that even this scenario number 2 is nothing to be afraid of, then please continue to the next thought experiment. In this thought experiment, the angel brings in a perfect replica of you, like in experiment 1. There is, however, a big difference. Here, the angel does not bring in a zombie, but an actual copy of you. A perfect copy of your body, of your brain, and of the content of your brain. In other words, there are two identical copies of you, body and soul. He then kills the original copy, always painlessly, naturally, and removes the corpse. Now, the second copy of you will wake up in the morning, and if it wasn't for the footage from the hidden camera, he would have no idea what had happened to him during the night. Okay, so this thought experiment, in reality, if you think about it, is simply a combination of the first two. As in the first experiment, the angel creates a second version of you. And as the second experiment, this copy of you is functionally identical to the original. Remember, in experiment 2, the angel recreates you whole after incinerating you. And you have accepted that in case 2. So under these circumstances, I ask, once again, once you've overcome the initial emotional shock, would you be afraid to go to bed and to go to sleep? And here, again, I should think not. After all, you have accepted scenarios 1 and scenarios 2, and this is but a combination of the two. The only difference is that in experiment 2, the copy is created after the old body is destroyed, while in this experiment 3, the new copy is created before the original copy is destroyed. But as far as the old copy is concerned, why would there be any difference? So rationally, if you accept scenarios 1 and 2, there's no reason why you should not accept scenario 3. And again, once you have completely accepted and you're convinced yourself that this scenario logically presents nothing to be afraid of, then please continue to the next thought experiment. This experiment is in everything identical to the previous one, except for a small detail. The angel appears again and again brings in a perfect functional copy of you. But here's the difference. He now wakes up the original copy of you. So now you are aware and experience everything. Now the angel continues by painlessly killing you just like before. But this time, the original copy of you witness your last minute of your life. In this case, the original copy, witnesses his own death. And you might argue that this is a big deal. But is it? Is it a deal breaker? Let's remember that you have seen the evidence. You've seen the video camera footage. Therefore, you already knew before you went to sleep that you would be killed that night. Just like you knew in experiment 3. No difference there. In both cases, you knew it. Therefore, when you wake up and see the angel in front of you, well, that would be nothing unexpected. You should not be surprised. The fact that the original copy witnesses his own death, therefore, changes really nothing in terms of what he knew and what actually happens. Therefore, objection to experiment 4, while not objecting to experiment 3, can only be for reasons that are unrelated to the facts. That is, it would be an emotional rather than rational reaction. And we said that we will try to avoid emotional reactions. Therefore, please convince yourself that even in this case that seems to be so extreme, well, scenario 4 is okay, because it's in all similar to scenario 3. Only difference is that you witness something that otherwise you wouldn't witness. Now, at this point, let me resume our little journey, okay? We saw that scenarios 1 and scenarios 2 are easily acceptable. We saw that scenario 3 is virtually identical to scenario 1 and scenario 2. Actually, it's a combination. And we see that even scenario 4 is not substantially different from scenario 3. Therefore, is also acceptable. Now, once you have convinced yourself that you've not skipped anything, that everything is completely rational, and that you, therefore, should not be afraid of anything, even in scenario 4. At that point, please continue to the next video, to the next thought experiment. This experiment is a simple variation of experiment 4. The difference is that what happens only happens once and not every night. This is because the angel does not bring a replacement copy of you. He simply wakes you up so that you're aware of your situation and then just proceeds to painlessly kill you. Now, of course, this particular experiment is not an experiment at all. In fact, this is what usually happens when we die. In general, we witness our own death and there is no replacement. Now, let's think, is this situation really different from the previous one, from situation number 4? After all, in both cases, we witness our own personal death, which is exactly what we fear as existential fear. Yes, of course, if there is a copy, that particular copy can be of use in the sense that it could continue taking care of your family, continue building a legacy for you, or finishing your projects. But we had said that all these things belong to the category of secondary concerns, which is not what we're talking about right now. When it comes to existential fear, when faced to our own personal death, that is what we are afraid of. And in this case, just like in case 4, we are in front of our own death. And at that situation, we don't really care if there is a copy or if there isn't a copy. Therefore, as far as we are concerned, if we have accepted experiment 4 as being benign, then there is absolutely no logical reason why we couldn't accept case 5 as benign. If this is the case, if you finally convince yourself of this, well, you have arrived at a situation where you no longer consider death from an existential point of view as being threatening to you, at least not rationally speaking. Emotionally, of course, you may still think that way, but we're going to take care of the emotional part later. At this juncture, at this point, you are convinced from a rational standpoint that existential fear of death is no more rational than fear of falling asleep. I want to mention a thought by Mahatma Gandhi. He famously said, "Each night when I go to sleep, I die. And in the morning, when I wake up, I am reborn." So now you should be in a position to fully understand and accept this quote from Gandhi. If you're not afraid to go to sleep, you should not be afraid of existential fear of death, in other words. Fundamentally, these experiments can be reviewed in a much smaller, faster statement. And the statement goes as follows. Existential fear of death is irrational because until I am still alive, there is no death. When death finally arrives, I will not be there. Therefore, death is an enemy that we will never meet. Is it rational to be afraid of an enemy that we shall never meet? Now that we have convinced ourselves that existential fear of death is irrational, we are still faced with the emotional background. And this is because we have methodically avoided to consider emotional issues and emotional considerations. We only looked at what to think and avoided looking at what to feel. Unfortunately, phobias, like fear of death, are deeply rooted in the subconscious. In your subconscious is what's really responsible for your emotions. A lot of your emotions are based on your subconscious. Famously, the subconscious is not very good at listening to reason. In other words, the subconscious does not respond directly to intellectual workings of your conscious mind. And therefore, even though you accepted rationally that death should not be feared, your subconscious may not have accepted it. And this is why you're still afraid. Rather, a method must be utilized to convey the information to your subconscious. And so you bring in harmony what you know to be true with what you should feel to be true. This is really the province of cognitive behavioral therapy. This is what CBT does extremely well. So I urge you to get informed about CBT or actually see a therapist. That is the way to go. Here I simply suggest a particular technique that you can research on the internet, and this is the practice of affirmations. This means that you regularly voice out statements that affirm a truth you want your subconscious to accept. And here are some examples. Dying is like going to sleep. Or, I have been already in a state of non-existence before I was born. Been there, done that, no big deal. Or, after I die, I will have no sensation. Therefore, nothing can affect me negatively. Nothing bad can happen to me because I am not there to feel it. Or, before I die, there is no death and I'm fine. After death, there is no me, and that's fine. You might want to come up with your own affirmations, especially if they deal with aspects that are especially important to you. In my case, for instance, I say something that revolves around being afraid to die is no less silly than being afraid to go to sleep. Just remember, though, when doing affirmations, not to use negative forms in your language. As an example, you could say, I feel fine, but do not say, I don't feel bad. Even though the two mean the same things, because of some idiosyncrasies of your subconscious, the subconscious is not very sensitive to negative language. I hope this video was helpful to at least someone out there who suffers from thanatophobia. If nothing helps, I hope it helped to better frame your fears, to divide them. Remember, divide and conquer. Divide them in more manageable categories so that they can be better analyzed, better faced, and better fought. More specifically, I hope that this video was helpful in making clear that existential fear of death at the end of the day is silly, and I thought that maybe the thought experiments may have been useful. I hope so. So again, I hope this helped, and thank you very much for watching.